It's been a busy week in the world of jihad here in the United States. Three aborted attacks, one involving a man based in Denver, an Afghan by birth, operating an airport shuttle bus, who apparently wanted to blow up, we're told, trains underground in New York City. There was an abortive attack involving a skyscraper in Dallas, Texas, and another one involving a federal courthouse in Springfield, Illinois. This shortly after another plot was uncovered in North Carolina that apparently was targeting the Marines' Quantico base. We're assured by law enforcement that there's no connection between these various attacks. Well, of course there is. I'm not saying that they were coordinated at a tactical level or that operationally they were all part of a grand conspiracy, but I am saying that there's a connection between them all. That connection is what authoritative Islam calls Shariah. All of these attackers, alleged attackers, we must say at this point, all of them embrace the requirement that the traditional institutions, texts, interpretations, academic centers, and practices of authoritative Islam requires of them, namely jihad. Jihad of either the violent kind, which these various plots suggested was what they had in mind, or of a more insidious and stealthy kind. I'll come back to that in a minute. Let's just stay with the violent sort of jihad. Pretending that there is no underlying animus or purpose to this series of seemingly otherwise random attacks is kind of like saying to the medical community or the scientific community, deal with outbreaks of what we now call swine flu without trying to figure out what it is. What is the virus that is causing these outbreaks, producing these symptoms? Now, that obviously wouldn't make any sense at all. You certainly couldn't figure out how to contain the disease, to decide, for example, whether it's a good idea to keep kids in school or keep schools open or close the schools or bring kids home and keep them home, give them Thermoflu or give them something else to try to deal with the virus, let alone come up with a vaccine that would be capable of preventing the further spread of this disease. You couldn't possibly do it. Well, I'm suggesting that you can't possibly counter all of those who are engaged in or hope to be engaged in jihad against this country without understanding why they want to do it, which gives you some clue as to who might be trying to do it, and gives you some basis upon which you might be able to begin to counteract the threat. In other words, as with swine flu, we're dealing with a virus. I think it's called Shariah. It's what authoritative Islam calls their program, and I think we need to be able to focus on it if we hope to both counter its immediate manifestations, let alone to defeat it, which is ultimately what we have to do. Now, this is made more complicated, to be sure, by the stealthy kind of jihad. The fact that we have, particularly in the Muslim Brotherhood and the myriad front organizations or associated groups. In fact, think of a Muslim American organization in America, and chances are it is a Muslim Brotherhood front or one of its allies. These organizations are aggressively trying to dissemble about what I've just said. In fact, they wind up calling people like me racists and bigots and Islamophobes for even pointing out that Sharia explicitly requires its adherents to engage in jihad of the violent or stealthy kind, or if they're not going to do that, at least to provide support for those who are. In fact, interestingly enough, 4 out of 8 of the bases upon which tithing, or zakat, as they say in Arabic, can be done, an obligation of faithful Muslims, 4 of the 8 are explicitly related to jihad or support for those who are engaged in it. So when the President of the United States says, we've got to clear the way for people to be engaged in zakat in this country, he is explicitly ignoring past experience, which has given rise to material support for terror, the Holy Land Foundation and other Muslim charities. But worse, he's ignoring the reality that zakat is, at least 50% of the time, supposed to be about helping those who are following the path of jihad for the purpose of bringing about the caliphate and imposing on all of us, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, this global theocracy that will make Shariah the worldwide standard. Now, how are the stealthy jihadists' various concessions they're demanding of us being evidenced? Well, there are a number of different ways. You see Muslim footbaths being installed in public spaces like the University of Michigan. You see corporations providing Muslim-only prayer rooms and time off for their workers for prayer, just the Muslims. You see the government, in some localities at least, allowing taxi drivers to decide whether they'll pick up passengers or not on the basis of whether they consider them, as the Sharia adherents say, halal or haram, pure or impure. If they've got dogs or alcohol, they're considered impure and the taxi driver need not pick them up. At least that was what the government up in Minneapolis was allowing them to do for a time. You have Sharia-compliant finance now being insinuated into our financial system and houses, what its proponents call financial jihad, or jihad with money. You have unhygienic practices being permitted for Muslims in food processing plants, where they insist that that's what's required by their religion. Never mind what it might mean to the food supply and to those who are consuming such foods. You have public school curricula in California promoting Islam as though it were not simply a faith, but as though it were the absolute truth, whereas treatments of Christianity or Judaism are treated very much as faith. People believe certain things, people claim certain things. And not only that, but in some cases in California you have sort of 2 weeks of indoctrination into Islam. These are all seemingly innocuous, seemingly perhaps even inconsequential in their own right. It's when they're taken together with practices like these, when they're authorized or enabled or simply acquiesced to by the population or the governments involved, it leads inexorably towards a state of submissiveness to Sharia that is very worrying. Don't take my word for it. Look at what's happening in Europe right now. Just to give you one example, there are now 751 zones sensibles urbaines, sensitive urban zones in France, which is to say places that are now keep-out zones, no-go zones for French authorities, the police and others. In those zones, Muslim-only zones as a practical matter, Sharia is being practiced instead of the law of the land. This is inexorably where the Muslim Brotherhood and its stealthy form of jihad, usually aided and abetted, if not by actual violence, the threat of violence. Where this takes Western societies. So it's absolutely imperative that as we're looking at symptoms of a very deadly disease, a disease that has explicitly the destruction of our civilization at its core, that seeks to replace our government, our freedoms, our way of life with one of their making, pursuant to Shariah. We must understand that this toxic virus is at work if we wish to counter the disease, let alone survive it.